Is there poetry in wholesale plumbing?
Sure. Yeah, all these things enter into a poet's life. An honest poet will write about what he knows, of course, and that's what we're doing every day.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from Joe Steiniger and Mary McDonald in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
Let me start by making a little confession here. I came to appreciate poetry late in life, or, later in life, well after my college days when I was learning about it. When I was younger, poetry sometimes intimidated me and sometimes frustrated me. Why couldn't these poets just write something straightforward in complete sentences and without so many metaphors? I got over that, though, and while I'm still not one to sneak off into my room and write poetry, I do appreciate how we can connect with a good poem. Jim Bourey didn't wait as long to appreciate poetry, but he falls into the category of coming to be a published poet later in life. He has his poetic eyes trained on his surroundings in the North Country these days. He describes himself as the self-appointed poet laureate of Dickinson Center. And while that is an honorary title, he is hard at work in the borderlands, helping to make poetry part of life in places like Malone and Potsdam. If you're going to meet up with a poet for an interview, it really ought to be at a coffee shop. And so I met up with Jim Bourey at a quaint little place in Malone called Tim Hortons, where we talked about where poetry falls in his life, his history, and the life and history of the North Country. Thank you so much for meeting me here.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I guess the question I have, it's really easy to imagine poets plying their trade in places like, maybe Paris or London or Brooklyn or even like Burlington, Vermont. Is there a poetry to Northern New York and rural America that you don't think people appreciate?
I do. The North Country, it's loaded. And there are some recognized poets. There's Roger Mitchell down in Jay, New York, who is nationally known. But most of us up here, we don't get, even the academics don't get too much recognition. So. And I'm nowhere near academic, so.
Well, and I wonder if there's a certain inspiration for poetry that's maybe closer to the surface in a place like rural America.
Well, yeah, you've got. First of all, you have nature, of course, but you also have a lot of hard times up here, so. That's an inspiring thing, too. So.
Yeah, and speaking of hard times, I gather one of the projects you're working on right now is about is a history project, a history poetry project about a particular community that's really kind of experienced hard times over the years.
I'm working on a thematic collection of poems. Has to do with the Line Mountain Standish area. It's hopefully I'm trying to capture the voices of a lot of the people that went through the rise and the fall, which was actually fell back in the 60s. It was 1967 when it went down. But and there's a lot of towns just like Line Mountain up this way. Mineville, Port Henry is another one. But they had mines or they had other kinds of industries that were really strong, and then they went right down the tubes. As the 20th century came to an end there. So,
well, and the poem I've seen is I guess what's called a found poem that consists of dialogue. I can't remember the name of the poem itself, but
you have a good memory. That's pretty good. Yeah, I've recorded poems, written poems of things I've overheard in. I work at the Line Mountain Museum on Wednesdays and Saturdays sometimes, and when people come in, they tell stories, and all I do is listen to their stories, and I try to capture their voices in a poem. Yeah.
You're sitting in a corner while they're talking and hoping they're not noticing you take notes?
I usually, even though I'm 76, I still remember some things. So it works pretty well.
Well, and presumably you're the poet. You can take artistic license if you need to make the lines work a little bit better.
We can lie as long as we tell the truth. That's what we do.
What's your hope for what comes out of that?
A little bit of history, but I want to show the experience of first of all, the early miners it was a really, really hard place to live. It was very, very difficult. But they kind of tamed it was like a Wild West, but the territory got tamed, So I want to tell that story. But then there was some great prosperity for several years. World War II, the mining community was really, really prosperous. And it was a good place to work if you could get through the conditions of being underground and so forth. But it was always dangerous. But then there was a decline, and I've been talking to quite a few people who lived through that part of it. And there was a fear, there was an underlying fear of what's coming next, So I want to try and tell that story. I think it's an important story of a rise and fall of a small community. I think it needs to be heard. Yeah.
Tell me about your journey to becoming a poet. I hear it's not one that I don't know if there's a typical way that someone becomes a poet, but you've sort of fallen into this life later in your chronology.
Yeah, quite a bit. I've always written poetry. I started when I was in high school, but I never tried to get anything published, and then life kind of got in the way. Had to earn a living, and even though I kept writing, I never really tried to get out there, and I really didn't get too deeply into poetry until I retired. I was fortunate I could retire when I was 60 years old, and that's when I started to study, and I found a mentor. I found she guided me through what to read, kind of gave me a off the books MFA, if you will. and
there are worse things to get.
Yeah, and it worked out. And I went to a lot of workshops, did a lot of study, and it worked out. And then shortly after I retired, I had a chapbook published, and then a couple others came along after that. So 3 others actually.
Wow. What were the kinds of jobs that you worked over the years?
Okay, well, I came out of the Air Force in 1968. I went to work for a bank. I was a banker. Stuck with that for a while. I didn't like doing collections, so I went into sales, and I was in industrial sales. I traveled. Actually, this was part of my territory at one time up here in North Country. And
where were you living at the time?
At that time, we were living in Syracuse, New York. Yeah, but I was born in Malone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm from Malone.
Which is how you ended up
here
now.
Okay. Back here now. and my family originated in Line Mountain.
Oh, okay.
So, then I was, I was part owner of a music store for a while. I became interested in car sales. I was a car salesman for a while. But then I went into the plumbing and heating and air conditioning wholesale business. And that's where I ended up for my last 20 years or so.
Is there poetry in wholesale plumbing?
Sure.
Is any of it in any of these chapbooks?
Yes, actually, yes. There's I have 2 poems about pipe that I can think of off the top of my head. And yeah, all these things enter into a poet's life. Everything that an honest poet will write about what he knows, of course, and that's what we're doing every day.
Well, I guess I wonder, given all of these different things that you've done over your years, whether there's a certain kind of MFA, and if those years kind of gave you an MFA in their own way, an ability to observe people from different walks of life.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, when you've dealt with people, first you're trying to convince them of something. That's one thing. So you learn to listen, and that's probably one of the more important parts of poetry, is knowing how to listen to people and to listen to yourself and to what's going on around you. So you're learning as you go. You go through parenthood. There's a lot of things that you can write about parenthood, and even though poetry can sometimes be, if you're not trying to get published, it can be like keeping a journal in a lot of ways. You just want to refine the language a little bit and turn it into something that's a little more permanent than a journal. Although journals are pretty good, but that's true.
Do you think there's an importance in poetry in a place like this that people don't appreciate? Not necessarily an importance in terms of, like, the subject being, we were talking about closer to the surface, but I mean, you've done some projects with I guess school kids here in Malone.
Yeah, I did that with the Malone Middle Schools, with the downtown art cellar. Jennifer Bilo owns that, and we brought in some kids, 7th and 8th graders. We taught them how to write a small poem, and I'll tell you a little more about that. But and then they decorated them with their art, and that's what we did. We created little poems. We put them on stickers. 400 of them went out into the community. And
what were the kinds of things that they wrote about?
Well, some kids wrote about getting along with other people. Some kids wrote about nature. Some kids wrote about what they wanted to do in the wintertime. All kinds of things.
Well, and so you walked in the door, and there were some kids that had never been exposed to poetry before. How did you introduce them to it?
Well, I showed them that there's poetry in some of the kids' books that they've read when they were younger. Dr. Seuss, I showed them Dr. Seuss. I showed them Shel Silverstein. And when they could see it didn't have to be something difficult, something really hard to think about, they became interested. And then there were some that had some pretty good insights as well. So they showed me a few things. So it was good.
Well, yeah, and I was going to ask whether you felt like you learned a little something about either about poetry or the community or both.
Probably both, and probably more than they did. So it was very interesting. I had a really good time with it.
When did you first get exposed to poetry?
Oh, probably 3rd grade, 4th grade back then. We had teachers who liked to read poetry. We had, I can recall, my 6th grade teacher was terrific. His name was Sal Catalino, and he would, every day he read a poem. I had a principal in junior high. Every assembly he would read a poem. Usually it was Robert Surf, some kind of adventurous sounding poem, and I was always captivated by it. I actually had a teacher who would, most Monday mornings, he would jump up on the desk and recite a poem from memory. And yeah, those days are, you don't have those anymore. Not too many that I hear about.
I have to ask my son if any of his teachers jump up on the desks. And
that was Mr. Warner. He was a terrific guy. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Walk me through a day in the life of the self-appointed poet laureate of Dickinson Center. When do you write?
I try to write in the morning. I get up fairly early. I'm usually up and moving around 7 o'clock, and I try to work for a couple hours even before breakfast. And then I read a lot. That's another thing. If you're going to write poetry, you better be reading it. You'll never be that effective as a writer if you're not a reader. And so I read a lot. And then I try to do the revision process. I do save that for later in the day. And I do a lot. I'm a compulsive reviser. So I've got a poem. As a matter of fact, I had a poem I was working on yesterday that I started in 2013. That is in its 32nd revision. So
a 10-year poem.
Yeah, that's right. And that's not unusual.
Sure, it's not an epic?
No, it, for all the work I put on it, it should be a lot longer than it is. But it isn't.
Well, and I hope this isn't too nosy a question,
No.
but I'm curious to, where in your house do you write? What are you looking at? What is the,
Okay.
do you have to, do you have to shut yourself in a room?
Yeah, pretty much. I have two places. I have an office. It's got picture windows. I'm looking out over the river, the Deer River. We live there. So I can, and I do. I spend a lot of time just staring out the window. But I also have a little screen house that sits right at the edge of the river. Our property's got a big drop down to the Deer River. I sit there quite a bit. I can bring my paper and computer even out there and work. But yeah,
You anticipated my next question, which was, do you write on a laptop or do you have a notebook?
I do both. I write. Sometimes the only way I can get to it get to the poem is with pen and paper. Other times it comes out pretty good, and I can work right onto a word processor, or not a word processor, laptop. Boy,
I still say word processor. It's all right. I still have 4 manual typewriters. Okay, so.
Oh, see, I got rid of mine.
Did the people, the years you were working in plumbing wholesaling and selling cars and all the other things you did the people you worked with know that you were a poet at the time?
They didn't. They knew I was writing. They didn't know I was. I did newsletters for the company. I wrote a lot of letters to the editor. That was a kind of crazy period. But then, I would write stories, and sometimes I would share them. And sometimes people would ask me to write a eulogy now and then. But no, I wasn't real common knowledge. I wasn't out there. I hadn't come out at that time.
You weren't doing poetry slams on the car lot.
No, not a bit.
Do you think the 25-year-old Jim Bourey, who was writing and not necessarily sharing his poems with anybody, what do you think he would think of the Jim Bourey today who has these chapbooks in front of him and is doing readings in public?
He would probably he'd probably be amazed, actually. At the time, it was all about basically earning enough money so that someday my kids could go to school, college, which they did, thank you. And that wasn't in my mind too much. It didn't really get back into my mind until I was around 50, and I was looking ahead to what am I going to do when I retire, and that's when I started really thinking I better get going on this life. So because it is a life, they talk about living the poetic life. There is something to that. You have to kind of slow down. You have to start being more and more observant. You have to start listening better.
I was going to ask you. We were meeting up here in this Tim Hortons in Malone, and I was running a few minutes late, and I wondered if you were sitting at this table, kind of looking around you, soaking up material.
Sometimes I do. I have a lot of bar poems. I've got a lot of poems of sitting in fast food places. I do, but. This time I was actually organizing my schedule for the next few days. So.
You were not writing a poem called
No.
Ice Double Double.
No.
Well, sadly, if there's no Ice Double Double, I would love you to read something else.
Okay, I can read a poem. Let's see. Well, I talked about career, so I'm going to read a career poem that I wrote. Black iron pipe, stacked by diameter, the smallest tight around my little finger. I could poke my head into the largest, but all the sizes were long, over 20 heavy feet each. My first job was to move the stacks. My second was to cut the pipe into equally measured pieces and machine threads on every end. We called those finished pieces nipples. I don't know why. They offered no sustenance or pleasure. In time, I no longer had to do hot, dirty work. It became my task to buy and sell the steel and copper and plastic lengths. I sold it by the truckload. Fancy that. Miles and miles of pipe carrying liquids, gases, and wastes of all kinds. And though it all got me somewhere, in the end, I had barely moved.
Jim Bourey, thank you so much. It's been just great to talk to you, and here's to many more terms as the Poet Laureate of Dickinson Center.
Thank you very much, Mitch. I've enjoyed it.
That is the self-appointed Poet Laureate of Dickinson Center, New York, otherwise known as Jim Bourey. He's published several chapbooks of poetry, including his most recent, a collaboration with Linda Blasky called Season of Harvest. Jim will be one of several St. Lawrence area poets leading an open mic event at the Potsdam Public Library on Sunday afternoon, September 17th. Our conversation was recorded on site at the Tim Hortons in Malone, New York, and no Timbits were harmed in the making of this episode. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Northwards. I'm Mitch Teich. I hope you enjoyed our interview, and you can catch new content every Friday right here or wherever you get your podcasts. Find out more about Northwards and NCPR on our mobile app or at our website, ncpr.org. And while you're there, make a donation to support everything you hear on North Country Public Radio.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, edited, and produced by Mitch Teich with digital production supervision by me, Ethan Shanty. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, Bill Hanel is our digital director, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To support this show and find more podcasts, visit ncpr.org. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.